The reading that is appointed for Mountain Sunday comes to us from the gospel that we know as Mark, from a section that is entitled Chapter 6. New Testament scholars refer to this section of chapter 16. New Testament scholars refer to this chapter, this particular section of the chapter, as the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark. The much debated text reads as follows. Finally, the risen Christ appeared to the 11 themselves while they were at table and scolded them for their disbelief and their stubbornness, since they had put no faith in those who had seen Jesus after the resurrection. Then Jesus told them, "Go into the whole world and proclaim the good news to all creation. The one who believes it and is baptized will be saved. The one who refuses to believe it will be condemned. Signs such as these will accompany those who have professed their faith. In my name they will expel demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will be able to handle poisonous snakes. If they drink anything deadly, it will not harm them, and the sick upon whom they lay their hands will recover." Then, after speaking to them, the Savior was taken up into heaven and was seated at God's right hand. The disciples went forth and preached everywhere. Christ worked with them and confirmed their message through the signs which accompanied them. This is where this unusual choice for a text on Mountain Sunday ends. It is also where the Gospel of Mark ends in most copies of the New Testament that are published currently. Please be seated. As you sit, I will tell you a secret. When I was in seminary, we were warned by our homiletics professor, a very wise man, that if this text ever comes up in the lectionary, preach on something else. Sorry, Ed, I'm not going to take your advice. The season of creation was established in 1989 by European Christians, mostly Protestant churches. It was embraced by the Roman Catholic Church as recently as 2015. It is the newest addition to the church calendar, designed to respond to the groaning of creation as our earth suffers at the hands of humanity. We here at Holy Cross have been observing the season of creation since 2011. The season begins on September the 1st and ends on October 4th, which is the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of animals. Today is the fourth Sunday in the season of creation, the day for the celebration of mountains. When I began my preparations for this Mountain Sunday, I was more than a little perplexed by the prescribed readings for this particular Sunday. I must confess that I struggled to understand why the powers that be chose to prescribe such strange readings. So I changed the first two readings. I was about to change the gospel reading and follow the advice of my wise professor. I didn't want to preach on this strange text. It's a dubious text. So I wanted to preach on something else. So I thought, the Sermon on the Mount, that's pretty safe. I could preach on that. And then I thought, no. Let's stick with the prescribed reading and see what we can learn from it. When you go home today, open up your Bible to the very end of the Gospel according to Mark, and you will discover a biblical chapter unlike any other chapter in the Bible. The last chapter of the Gospel is chapter 16. When you get to the end of verse 8, you will find a note from most editors, particularly of the newly revised standard, or even some of the more fundamentalist publishing houses will put that note in there from the editor. And at the end of verse 8, it will say, "The gospel ends here." Others simply put in a note that says 2 other endings were added by later writers: the shorter ending or the longer ending. The prescribed reading for Mountain Sunday is the longer ending, which was added, like the shorter ending, by a later writer. The Gospel of Mark was written by an anonymous gospel storyteller that was given the name Mark by something called tradition. We don't know who wrote this gospel. We do know that it was the first of the Gospels to be written. We also know that it was written sometime after the year 70. That's some 40 years after the execution of Jesus by the Romans. And about 20 years after the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. Paul's writings about Jesus are the oldest writings about Jesus that we have. The anonymous gospel storyteller that we know as Mark was not an eyewitness to the life of Jesus. And it doesn't matter how many times I say this, I'm going to keep saying it. The writer of the gospel that we call Mark was not one of the 12 apostles, the one named Mark, not the same person. This particular anonymous storyteller wrote the story sometime after the Roman Empire was destroyed, after the Roman Empire destroyed the city of Jerusalem, The Romans leveled the city and sent Jews and followers of the way running for their lives. This gospel is the shortest of the gospels, and in this gospel there is no virgin birth. There is no birth narrative at all. Joseph, the father of Jesus, is never mentioned in the gospel according to Mark. Jesus is simply referred to as Son of Mary. Now that might sound innocuous to you, but in the first century that would have been an insult. The gospel writer is casting aspersions on Jesus. He's implying that Jesus is a bastard. That's how it would have been understood in the first century. This short gospel ends very abruptly with the women fleeing the empty tomb. There are no appearances of Jesus following the visit of the women. Now, I put an insert. It's green, it's in all your bulletins, and it has chapter 16 in it. Both chapter 16 that comes to us from the anonymous gospel storyteller that we know as Mark, and both of the other endings that were added by later writers. Let me read for you the ending of the gospel according to the anonymous gospel storyteller we know as Mark. These are verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought perfumed oils so that they could anoint Jesus. Very early, just after sunrise, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked, they found that the huge stone had been rolled back. On entering the tomb, they saw a young person sitting on the right, dressed in a white robe. They were very frightened, but the young person reassured them. "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Now go and tell the disciples and Peter. Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you." They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling. But they said nothing to anyone because they were so afraid. The end. The women fled from the tomb and told nothing to anyone because they were so afraid. Then we have the editor's note. The gospel ends here. 2 different endings were added by later writers. The shorter ending reads, as you can see there, and immediately they reported all these instructions to Peter and his companions. After this, through them, Jesus sent forth the holy and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Now that is very different from saying nothing because they were so afraid. That's a completely different ending. The shorter option is followed by the longer ending, which is today's assigned reading. Now, there are more than a few problems with both of these later endings. First of all, the language and style of the Greek in the later endings is not the same as the rest of the gospel. And the oldest manuscripts of this gospel do not include either of these endings. The oldest manuscripts end with the women fleeing the empty tomb. In the 3rd century, neither Clement of Alexandria nor Origen seem to know anything about these later editions. Nothing at all. As late as the 4th century bishops Eusebius and Jerome, you will find them attesting to the fact that neither the shorter nor the longer ending appear in the manuscripts. That's the end of the 4th century. Remember, these copies of the gospel were written out by hand. We know that in 313, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which began the co-opting of Christianity. We know that Jesus of Nazareth embodied non-violence. Indeed, after Jesus' execution by Romans, his followers refused to take up arms. You could not be a follower of the way and a soldier. You had to choose nonviolence to be a member of the community of followers of Jesus. Once Constantine co-opts Christianity, not only does Christianity become an imperial religion, the Roman Empire marches to war with the cross of Jesus going on before. From nonviolence to militarism in just a few decades. How is this possible? The New Testament Canon was established at the end of the 4th century. It was the Holy Roman Catholic Church that determined what made it into the New Testament. They didn't call it the Roman Catholic Church in those days. They called it the Holy Roman Empire. Empire decided what was in and what was out. Empire decided what would serve the needs of the empire and what would not. The original ending of Mark was viewed by imperial Christians as so lacking in authority, so inconclusive, that not only was Mark placed in second order in the New Testament, but various endings were added by editors and copyists in some manuscripts to try and spruce things up a little. The longest concocted ending, which became Mark 16, 9 through 19, became so treasured that it was included in the King James Version of the Bible, favored for the past 500 years by Protestants, as well as being included in translations of the Latin Vulgate, which is used by Roman Catholics. This meant for countless millions of Christians, it became sacred scripture. Now, does any of this really matter? Well, think about it. For those early followers of Jesus, the ones who only had the story as it is told in Mark, resurrection remains a mystery. There are no birth narratives and no post-execution appearances, only mystery. And yet the story of Jesus of Nazareth is so compelling that even after his execution, the Markan community of followers of the way are inspired to hope, to gather together, and to forge themselves into a nonviolent community. What was it about Jesus' nonviolent resistance to Roman oppression that inspired this kind of following? Remember, even if they had access to the letters of Paul, the Apostle Paul does not describe the resurrection of Jesus as the physical resuscitation of a corpse. The story about Paul meeting the risen Christ on the road to Damascus appears in the book of Acts, which wasn't written until somewhere between the years 75 and 90, long after the Gospel of Mark was written. About 20 years after the death of Paul, at least. Indeed, in all of his letters, Paul never mentions meeting the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, not even when people are challenging him. He never says, well, I've seen the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. In all the arguments that Paul made, he never mentions it. What the followers of the way are left with in the storyteller Mark's account is a mystery that gives them just a faint hope. Now go and tell the disciples and Peter, Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you. A faint hope that the storyteller dashes with. They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling, but they said nothing to anyone because they were so afraid. What an ending. Will the hearer, will the reader go on to Galilee as Jesus had told them to? Or will they flee? What will they do? What will you do? What does it mean to follow a nonviolent resistor of empire when the empire is coming down hard on you and your people? What might it mean for us to follow a nonviolent resistor of empire at a time when power is everything? Are we the followers of the mystery, or do we prefer a more imperial ending? Are we prepared to live with mystery? Or do we, like the Christians of the 3rd and 4th centuries, do we need it all wrapped up and made really clear? Mystery or the longer ending? Go into the whole world and proclaim the good news to all creation. So says the imperial empire's ending to the gospel. Go into the whole world and proclaim the good news to all creation. The one who believes it and is baptized will be saved. The one who refuses to believe it will be condemned. Does that sound like Jesus of Nazareth? Does it sound like the Jesus that the storyteller Mark portrays as the teacher who welcomed all to follow in his ways? Does that sound like the Jesus who, according to the storyteller Mark, insisted that the greatest commandment is love? Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. One thing I do know about the longer ending: it sure has come in handy over the centuries. Go into the whole world and proclaim the good news to all creation. The one who believes it and is baptized will be saved. The one who refuses to believe it will be condemned. Armies have marched. Nations and peoples have been condemned. Just ask our indigenous sisters and brothers about the doctrine of discovery, and you will hear what it meant to be recipients of this so-called imperial good news. Empires have been built thanks to imperial Christianity, thanks to Christianity's desire to baptize or to condemn. If it is indeed our desire to follow the way that Jesus of Nazareth embodied when he pointed toward a deity who is love and bid us to follow in the way of love by loving God, loving our neighbors as we love ourselves, and yes, that means loving our enemies as well. If this is the way we want to follow, then it's long past time to remove the imperial endings, both the shorter and the longer endings. Remove them and restore the mystery. As for the anonymous gospel storytellers, Matthew and Luke, who the New Testament scholars point to as the sources of these imperial endings, let's remember that they wrote long after Mark, perhaps as late as 85 or 90, in the midst of Imperial Rome's campaign to eradicate their communities from the face of the earth. Let us forgive them their desire for certainty. Let us forgive them their temptation to pass judgment. Let us guard against our own tendency to want certainty. Let us guard against our own preference to tie everything up in a neat little bow, and to insist that all that is necessary is to believe, and if you don't believe, you will be condemned. We have a mountain of history to climb over so that we can see beyond the violence of empire to the vision of God's holy mountain, a vision shared by the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, a mountain on which the wolf will dwell with the lamb, where there will be no harm, no destruction anywhere on God's holy mountain. For as the water fills the sea, so the land will be filled with knowledge of Yahweh. It is long past time for us to move beyond our imperial Christianity. Let us open ourselves to the mystery that is the love embodied by Jesus of Nazareth, who lives so fully and loves so fearlessly that in Jesus we can see the way of love. Jesus had no need of empire. What will you do? Will you flee from mystery, bewildered and trembling, and say nothing to anyone because you are so afraid? Will you cling to the power of empire? Or will you go on to Galilee, into the world, where you will see Jesus in the people of the world? Will you follow Jesus to embody love in the world? May we have the courage to see beyond the trappings of empire, beyond the violence the empire demands, beyond the allure of certitude that imperial religion dangles so tantalizingly before us. May we all have the courage to embrace the mystery that Jesus lived, taught, and died, pointing to, the mystery of the one who is love, the love in which lies our hope for peace, not the peace that empires promise, but the peace that is the shalom that comes when everyone has enough. Enough bread, enough shelter, enough security, enough money, enough justice, and enough love. May that peace come, and may we be a part of its coming. Amen.